Hey, what's up everybody? In this crash course tutorial for Shadows of Esteren by Studio Agate, I'm going to go over my personal favorite part of this game. Sanity.
Cyberpunk Uncensored.
Before I get into how Sanity works, I first want to read you this little intro and preamble that Studio Agate has put in the book. I think it's important and it lends itself to what I always say in that you should always have a session zero. I'll explain in a moment, but first let me read this. In Shadows of Esteren, the PCs will come to experience exceptional events which can leave a mark on their personalities. This part of the system is used to simulate the evolution of their sanity. Although it is strongly inspired by psychopathology, the sanity system presented in this book has mainly been developed with the express purpose of fitting the universe of Shadows of Esteren, not of being realistic or exhaustive. Its only goal is to give leaders and players simple tools to optimize the game atmosphere. However, using these rules is not strictly required to play Shadows of Esteren. Players and leaders should talk about it to know if they want to introduce such a dimension in their sessions. In general, only experienced and mature players should use these rules, and I can't agree more. So you should always have a session zero. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's very important to kind of see the play style that your players are expecting, for you to explain your game leader style, for you to understand lines and veils of each player, but also to go over things like sanity. Just like I express in the Metamorphosis optional rule video, you want to kind of go over sanity maybe in a bit more detail than Metamorphosis, since that has a sort of surprise aspect to it. In this case, maybe going over it a little more in detail is important because of the fact that some people might be triggered by conditions and disorders and things that come into play when sanity is used in this game. I personally love it. I love dark tabletop role-playing games, dystopian-style games, horror, things like that just have that darker, realistic tones to it. And I think this sanity aspect puts that in the game. It makes it, kind of dark, kind of fucked up, if you will, but it also leans into some heavy role play, which is something I'm very fond of. It's a main factor of why Shadows of Esteren is one of my favorite games. It's not so heavy on the rules, and it's encouraged to lean on the role play and the narrative and kind of create the story collectively between the game leader and players versus always relying on dice and strict rules. And this whole sanity thing really does push players into heavy role play, because as you develop these sort of syndromes and madness and symptoms and things, you're going to role play it into the character. It's going to affect the personalities, as it said here in the intro, and possibly trigger a crisis or some scarring. But let's get into that. Let's get into how it works, and I'll explain all of that by first showing you the sanity chart. The sanity chart here basically has 4 different sections. You'll see here: balance, symptom, syndrome, and madness. And each one has little bubbles that you're going to check off with temporary points or fill in for permanent. I mentioned in the combat video and healing and damage. I mentioned in healing and diseases to have distinctive marks to distinguish between temporary and permanent points. In this chart, you're also going to be using it for other things that I go over if you're optionally incorporating Metamorphosis into your gameplay. So make sure you have different ways to mark this that you can distinguish between what it's being used for. But ultimately, let's go over sanity and that aspect of this chart. So you're going to check off temporary points or fill in permanent points, and I'll go over how that happens. But, it all starts with a mental resistance check. Your mental resistance statistic, I go over that in the character creation tutorial, but ultimately it has to do with your conviction way stat, and then like +5 to that, I believe. But I go over that in character creation. But you basically have a mental resistance stat, and every once in a while you're going to have to make a check based on a threshold set by the game leader. When you enter sticky situations, messed up trying situations. There's no right or wrong way to describe when this comes into play. It's the game leader's discretion. Ultimately, it's when things get extreme, and it doesn't always have to be gruesome extreme. Like, keep in mind that, like, a real hardened combat, like knight, for example, might not need mental resistance checks when he sees a really gruesome scene, as maybe another player character might, right? Because he's seen a lot of gruesome scenes. He's been in combat. Maybe for that character, a mental resistance check will come into play when it's more of like a moral pull, like something that's really pulling on emotions or something. Maybe it's a real extreme moment like that. So it's up to the game leader to decide, but ultimately you're going to do those mental resistance checks in extreme situations. And don't overdo it. You don't want to, over push this. Use it sparingly. Make it count, I guess, is how I'd want to put it. But ultimately, like I said, you're going to have a threshold. Let me bring up the mental resistance difficulty threshold and trauma points. The game leader is going to set a difficulty threshold based on the situation. And again, there's no right or wrong way to set this. Maybe the really extreme situations might have a threshold of 20 or 25. Average might be like 17, 14. 11 might be, the easiest of mental resistance situations, right? You're going to see the trauma points here. These are basically what you're going to be checking off on your sanity chart over here that I showed you as you fail. But let me go into failing and succeeding and all that sort of stuff. When you do one of these checks, you take your mental resistance stat and you add a d10 to it. If you meet or beat the threshold, you basically don't take any trauma points unless there's some in parentheses. You automatically take the ones in parentheses even if you succeed, unless you have a critical success. If you roll a 10, it's considered a critical success, in which case you don't take any trauma points at all, but you do take a hardening point. So you'll see underneath this trauma point section, there's hardening, and you're going to check those off as you go. If you get a critical success 10, there's other ways that you can get a hardening point as well. I go over that in other crash course tutorials, but ultimately, yeah, if you rank all the way up, once you get into symptom, you get a +3 to all future mental resistance checks, and then syndrome, another +3, and then madness, another +3, because you're hardening as you go. But once you get up to you fill them all up, it becomes a problem. It becomes, one of your potential crises or disorders, I guess. It's called, I think, a empty warrior or something like that. I might not have that terminology exactly right, but basically you become a shell of a person, a shell of your character. You become so hardened that things aren't affecting you as much. But you can read the details of that in the book. But that's ultimately a hardening if you get a critical success on that mental resistance check there by getting that 10. Now, if you get a critical fail, if you roll a 1 on that check, a couple things happen here. First off is one of those temporary trauma points becomes permanent. So you're not just slashing it off, you're darkening in one of those trauma points. So yeah, that's how you can start racking up the permanent ones, is on a critical failure. The other thing that's going to happen is you're going to get some scarring. Unfortunately, you're going to get some scarring. Let's look at that chart here. So yeah, if you get that critical fail, then you're going to roll another 1d10, and you're going to get one of these issues here, one of these scars, if you will. And each one has its own thing, right? Each one's going to last its own length. It's going to affect you in its own way. You can read those details in the official rule book. But you can see here there's like nightmare, phobia, fleeing, fainting, obsession. There's, one of 10 things that could basically scar you if you get that critical fail. So yeah, you want to be careful when it comes to critical fails, and even with critical successes, in the sense that, hardening isn't necessarily a good thing if you're getting all the way up there. Yeah, it might help you on mental resistance checks, but it starts making you cold and a shell of what you once were. And again, like I said, all this stuff plays into the role playing. This sort of sanity system, like it's suggested, is made for experienced, mature players, because not only do you need to handle this sensitive topic of sanity, right, and disorders and things like that, but you need to be able to role play it properly and kind of present it so the other players and game leader and the reactionary NPCs based on game leaders, everything can kind of feel real. It can make sense and be immersive. So keep that in mind too. Let's go over, let's see here. Let's go over the mental disorders chart, because there's another level to this once you start filling things up. Let me first remind you of the 4 sections: balance, symptom, syndrome, and madness, right? So once you start getting into symptoms, syndrome, and madness, you have to start kind of role-playing into your disorder, the disorder that you set during character creation. I go over that in the character creation video. I'm going to go over it lightly here in a moment. But ultimately, once you get into symptom, you start role-playing that in. Once you get into syndrome and madness, and you fail a mental resistance check, you automatically go into a crisis, which is kind of like a sparked version or an outburst of that disorder. And those are all defined in the book in great detail based on symptoms, syndrome, madness, the different levels of how that disorder will affect you, and then obviously what will happen in a crisis. Again, it's suggestions. You can make it your own. You can kind of define it yourself and work on that with the player. A player might manipulate those slightly based on the character, right, and make it their own as well. So there's no right or wrong way to do this, but let's get into that mental disorder chart. So once you get up, like I said, to syndrome and madness, and you actually just fail, it doesn't even need to be a critical fail, just a fail. You trigger your disorder basically into a crisis, and that can stack with scarring. So if you not only fail, but you critical fail, and you're in one of those states, right, syndrome or madness, you're going to basically you're going to get that scarring from that critical fail, but you're also going to trigger your disorder. Now, a disorder you set during character creation, it's based on, you're going to pick one based on your major or minor way. Ways, again, being like your main stat. So like if your combativeness is like a 4 or 5, it's considered your major way. If it's down like a 1 or 2 or whatever, it's going to be considered minor. So your disorder is chosen between your either or your major or minor way. So like if, say, your major way is combativeness and your weakest or minor way is reason, right? So you'd be able to choose between frenzy, elation, or mental confusion. You see how that works there. But each disorder, like I said, they break it down in the book based on what section of sanity that you've triggered or gotten into, how to role play that, and then how that might affect a crisis if you land into a crisis situation by failing once you're in those higher levels of sanity, syndrome, and madness there on the chart. So yeah, that's basically how crisis works. Keep in mind too that a couple things happen that once you get up to that level in syndrome and madness, the first time that you enter into that section, syndrome, and in madness it happens again twice. 2 things happen. Basically, the ways that is associated with that disorder is going to go up by 1 point. So I guess that's kind of good when you have to do those checks. And that's going to go up one time when you enter into syndrome, and then again when you enter into madness. But one of your other ways, any of them, goes down by a point each time that you enter either syndrome and madness. Once in syndrome, 1 in madness. So keep that in mind that happens automatically when you get up to syndrome and madness. So yeah, it starts getting a little chaotic, a little brutal, a lot of things here to juggle. Again, the reason an experienced player and game leader is recommended when you incorporate sanity into your gameplay. But let's get into diagnosis and the disciplines required here, because, like I mentioned, there's temporary points, not just permanent. And temporary ones you can get rid of. You can heal, just like healing temporary damage points, right? So the first thing that you have to do, and these diagnoses, when a physician does the diagnosis of the patient or the character, it's going to be in 3 sections, basically. There's a general diagnosis with a complicated 14, and each one of these is going to be done by a particular discipline. I go over that again when I go over the core mechanics of the game in that tutorial about what a discipline is, which is a more refined skill. A domain is a kind of your skill, and disciplines are more specific, right, when you get up past 5 points up to 6+. But ultimately, all of these are going to require specific disciplines. I'm going to go over that in a second. But the general diagnosis is just a complicated 14, and that's when the physician can determine the disorder affecting the character. So now they can figure out basically the diagnosis. The next up would be the condition diagnosis, which would be a difficulty 17, and that would basically tell the character what stage they're in, the state of balance, symptom, syndrome, or madness. And then the last is complementary diagnosis with the difficulty of 20, which will let the player know exactly how many boxes are checked off, right, temporarily or permanently, and that way the character, the player, will now know where their character sits in that sanity chart. And that's something worth mentioning here is, when you run the sanity, the game leader and the player are both going to have that chart. This, let me bring that up here. They're both going to have this sanity chart right here, but ultimately, the game leader is going to be the one that knows exactly how many points they're filling in, because they know on what level of that threshold, right? Let me bring that up again. This mental resistance hurts. They're going to know how many trauma points are being delivered based on the difficulty threshold they set, that they decided based on the situation that the characters are going through. So the players aren't really going to know what their character is racking up in these points. The game leader is going to express that, you're entering these different syndromes, or you need to role play in certain ways, and they're going to express the situation narratively, right? And this is up to the game leader to kind of use their discretion, but they're going to push the players into role playing their characters particular ways as this is racking up, and they're going to get the different disorders. They might end up with some scarring, hitting a crisis, in which the game leader will describe that, and they'll role play that out. They'll get into it and stuff. But it isn't until you get into that diagnosis. Let me bring us back up here. And until you get into this diagnosis, and the complementary diagnosis to be specific, with that very difficult 20 resolution roll, that the players will find out exactly where they are at in that chart. But if they do figure out where they are at in that chart, at that point they can fill it out, and now they know. And then they can work on ways to heal that, right? So there's different ways that they can heal that. I'll go over that in a moment. But first, let me just read this little section here, because it expresses that sort of secretive role trauma point aspect that I was just kind of going over, where it says the game leader should have these rolls made secretly so that a player attempting them does not know whether he has succeeded or not. A simple failure on a resolution roll means that the physician is not sure about the diagnosis she must make. A failure obtained with a natural 1 leads to a diagnostic error. The more visible the symptoms of a patient are, the easier it is to succeed, which is reflected with a bonus to rolls for general and state diagnoses. So when you do those general and condition and state diagnosis, when you're in symptom, you get a +2. You get a little. You look at it like this: the physician gets a little hint of what's going on with the patient, because they're at that symptom level. They're showing some signs, I guess, is how you could explain it. Once they're in syndrome, which is a little more extreme, it's a +4, because now the physician, or game leader, if you will, that's making the roll, right? They see a little more evidence of the crisis, or the scarring, or the whatever is affecting the player, right? The disability, the mental anguish that they're going through, right? It's more evident. They're showing it more. When they're in madness, it's a +6, because obviously they're in madness. And keep in mind, madness doesn't mean that they're walking around rambling and they can't control their character anymore. The player's still in control, but that character is definitely a bit detached. Maybe they're noticed by NPCs or other players to being a little off. Whatever that diagnosis is, whatever the disability or mental scarring, or whatever the specific disorder, I should say, that the character has or is going through. And each one's going to be different. And like I said, there's no right or wrong way to do this. You can kind of define these to make sense to the particular character. But let me go over the disciplines real quick. Because I did mention that, when you do these checks, there are some specifics to getting these diagnoses, right? Diagnosis? There I am again, diagnosis. Someone in the comments, help me with that. I don't want to Google it. I just want you to let me know. All right. The knowledge of mental troubles and mental phenomena disciplines give very good knowledge in psychopathology, but not the ability to cure such afflictions. Only the mind treatment, spirituality, and hypnosis ones can. Conversely, these 3 disciplines cannot be used to establish a diagnosis. So you can see how, different disciplines are going to be used, whether you're, getting a diagnostic, or the physician's figuring out the details of these disorders and things you're going through, or if they're actually trying to heal them or remove those temporary points that you have there, those temporary trauma points. And the last thing I want to go over, I mentioned it earlier with the healing, is, not just with the physician doing the spirituality or hypnosis or whatever. As I mentioned, there's a few disciplines that you can use to remove the temporary and do some healing. But aside from that, there's also demorthans, there's magientists, there's alchemists. So there might be some type of artifact or medicine or something along those lines, or a demorthan sort of spiritual, rune-induced magic or something that could affect it. Maybe someone from the temple with prayer could help, which would be a form of, hypnosis, just like a cultist might use in their discipline. So keep in mind that there's no one way to heal this or deal with it. There's multiple ways, and again, nothing is set in stone. Make it your own so you and the players can have some fun. So there you have it. That's how Sanity works. I hope this video was helpful. Please leave a like, leave a comment, give us a share, subscribe to the channel. Let's help Shadows of Esteren and Studio Agate get as much attention as possible, because this game is awesome and I love it. I know you're going to love it too. Hopefully you dive in and start playing, and if you do, come back and leave a comment and let me know how it's going. I'd love to hear about gameplay and all the little details of campaigns and what game leaders and players come up with and go through. All right, thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Cybernation Uncensored.